The year is 1491. On the western edge of the known world, a vast, complex, and ancient landmass lay slumbering under the benevolent sun. It was a continent of impossible scales, a world away from the crowded, plague-scarred fields of Europe, yet inextricably linked to it by the very forces of nature and human ambition. This was not a wilderness waiting to be tamed, but a meticulously managed, deeply inhabited world, a colossal garden tended by millions of hands over millennia. This was the American shore, a prelude to the violent drama of colonization, known then only to its people. The land itself was a mosaic of extremes, utterly distinct from the compact, manicured fields of the Old World. To the east, the Appalachian Mountains, older than the Rockies and softer in profile, stood as a massive spine cloaked in ancient primeval forests, a rich, diverse canopy where some might struggle to reach the forest floor. These woods, far from being impenetrable, were crisscrossed by sophisticated networks of trails, managed by controlled burns that encouraged game and made travel easier for the native peoples. Along the coast, from the icy maritime lands of the north down to the humid semi-tropical swamps of the south, lay a ribbon of tidal marshes, sprawling river deltas, and sandy barrier islands, teeming with fish oysters and migrating waterfowl. In the continent's heart, the Mississippi River snaked like a lifeblood artery, draining a basin so vast that it challenged the imagination. The Great Plains beyond were not the empty grasslands of later myth, but bison-rich ecosystems shaped by both climate and the hunting strategies of nomadic and semi-nomadic groups. Everywhere, the environment was a dynamic, human-influenced landscape. The deep history of ingenuity European explorers, when they finally arrived, would describe the inhabitants as savages or primitive. This was arguably the greatest and most tragic misconception of the age. The indigenous societies of the continent were, in fact, exponents of an extraordinary level of ecological and social sophistication. They were not merely in the environment. They had shaped it, understood it, and thrived within it for thousands of years. Consider the Iroquois Confederacy, Haudenosaunee in the northeast. Far from being simple hunter-gatherers, they were masters of sophisticated, settled agriculture. Their farming revolved around the Three Sisters corn, beans, and squash polyculture system that naturally fertilized the soil, maximized yield, and provided a nearly perfect balance of nutrition. This agricultural base supported large fortified villages, often housing thousands, complete with complex political institutions, including the Great Law of Peace, a constitution that established a consensus-based democracy and a powerful alliance between 5, later 6, nations. The very longhouses they inhabited were feats of communal architecture and engineering. Further south, the Cherokee and Muskogee Creek nations cultivated fertile river valleys, living in sophisticated town and mound societies that reflected astronomical knowledge and hierarchical structures. Along the Mississippi, the remnants of the once great Mississippian culture still dotted the landscape. Cities like Cahokia, which had peaked centuries earlier, were evidence of urban centers that rivaled or exceeded the size of contemporary European cities like London or Paris, built upon massive earthen mounds used for ceremonial and residential purposes. The very existence of this past, largely unknown or ignored by the arriving Europeans, demonstrated a history of complex civilization and organization. On the West Coast, groups like the Chinook were masters of the sea and the river, relying on vast salmon runs. Their societies developed intricate social rankings based on wealth, demonstrated through spectacular potlatch ceremonies, which were not just feasts but complex economic redistributions. These varied examples illustrate that the continent was not sparsely populated. Estimates suggest populations ranging from 2 million to over 18 million across. North America, a thriving tapestry of different languages, economies, and worldviews. When the first European sails appeared on the horizon, Viking longships centuries earlier, or Spanish caravels and English pinnaces later, They carried more than just men and supplies. They carried a distinct and often incompatible worldview, heavily influenced by theology, feudalism, and a desperate search for wealth and land. Central to this clash was the concept of land ownership. For the European, land was a commodity, a transferable title that conferred power and status. The king owned it, the noble leased it, and the peasant worked it. To own land was to have a right to exclude others. For most indigenous societies, however, land was a resource to be used communally, a gift from the Creator that sustained life. While specific tribes defended hunting territories and planting grounds, the idea of an individual claiming permanent, exclusive dominion over a large tract of earth was alien. They understood stewardship and territorial integrity. They did not understand fee simple absolute. This conceptual disconnect, the native focus on use and the European focus on legal, title became the bedrock of every conflict to follow. Another critical misconception involved the wilderness. To the European, the American forests and plains represented chaos, an ungodly space awaiting the civilizing hand of man and the dominion promised in the book of Genesis. Their mission, as they saw it, was to transform the wild forest into orderly, fenced-in Christian fields. They did not recognize the vast forests as carefully managed parklands, where native burning practices controlled undergrowth and nurtured specific game populations. When they saw open space, they didn't see successful agriculture. They saw unused land, and under the legal concept of terra nullius, empty land, this perceived vacancy justified seizure. The Europeans were also utterly convinced of their own technological and religious superiority. They measured civilization by the metrics they knew: stone architecture, codified written law, Christian dogma, and steel tools. They dismissed the complex oral traditions, woven cedar houses, and sophisticated stone, bone, wood toolkits of the natives as markers of inferiority. The devastating effectiveness of their iron weapons and, more crucially, their resistance to old-world diseases only seemed to confirm their divine mandate. The invisible terror, the great dying, the arrival of the Europeans was not simply an exchange of cultures. It was a biological catastrophe unparalleled in human history. In the densely populated areas of the Northeast and Southeast, mortality rates are estimated to have reached 70% to 90%. Entire villages were wiped out. Social structures collapsed. Political confederacies fractured. The massive population loss had a profound psychological impact, leading to despair and an inability to resist subsequent European land claims effectively. The shores of misunderstanding by the early 17th century, the stage was tragically set. The Europeans, driven by economic necessity, the desire for gold furs and land, and religious fervor, saw a continent teeming with opportunity. Convinced that the sparse, disease-ridden pockets of remaining native life posed only a temporary obstacle to their God-given destiny, the indigenous peoples, reeling from the biological shockwave, struggled to understand the motives of the newcomers. They initially viewed the Europeans as odd, Technologically powerful trading partners, strange visitors who could supply valuable metal tools and cloth in exchange for beaver pelts and corn. They sought to integrate the Europeans into their existing diplomatic and economic structures, treating them as another tribe to be managed through alliance, trade, or war. Chief Powhatan, leader of a vast confederacy near the eventual site of Jamestown, epitomized this initial strategy. He saw the English as a potentially useful, if irritating, source of metal goods. He attempted to control their presence through strategic trade and occasional hostility, never grasping the fundamental European concept that they had not come to trade or coexist, but to possess the land absolutely. The untamed shore was thus a dual illusion. For the European, it was the illusion of a pristine, vacant land waiting for civilization. For the Native American, it was the illusion of control, the belief that these strange visitors could be managed like any other threat or opportunity they had faced in their long, rich history. This fundamental incompatibility of perspective, of ecology, spirituality, and property was the quiet, powerful force that would dictate the next 3 centuries of conflict, marking the true, violent prelude to the forging of a new nation. The whispers of gold, the promise of fertile lands, and the zeal of religious mission drew the English across the perilous Atlantic. Having watched Spain and France establish sprawling empires, England finally mounted its own sustained effort to plant settlements on the North American coast in the early 17th century. These endeavors were not born of royal design, but of private speculative risk. Financed by joint stock companies, a business model designed to spread risk and maximize profit. Yet, the venture proved immediately and brutally difficult. The first 2 permanent English outposts, Jamestown and the Chesapeake, and Plymouth and New England, were born not of grand success, but of starvation, mismanagement, and relentless, desperate struggle. They were the fragile, tentative seeds of Providence that would one day sprout into a nation. The Swamp and the Serpent, Jamestown, 1607, the Virginia Company of London, driven by the lure of mineral wealth, and a direct route to the Orient, dispatched 3 ships, the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery, carrying 104 men and boys. They anchored in the Chesapeake Bay in May 1607, selecting a low-lying, mosquito-infested peninsula on the James River for their settlement. They named it Jamestown in honor of their king. The choice was immediately catastrophic. The settlers, largely comprised of gentlemen, jewelers, and few practical laborers, lacked the collective will and necessary skills for survival. Their primary directive was to search for gold, not to plant crops or build sturdy shelter. The site, though strategically defensible against Spanish ships, was a brackish tidal swamp, poisoning their drinking water and breeding disease. Dysentery, typhoid, and malaria quickly became their grim companions. They had landed squarely within the territory of the powerful Powhatan Confederacy, an alliance of some 30 Algonquian-speaking groups led by the formidable chief Wahun Seneca, known to the English as Powhatan. Powhatan's strategy was complex. He recognized the technological advantage of the English, their copper, metal tools, and muskets, and initially sought to integrate them into his domain, not as equals, but as a subordinate trading outpost useful for its goods. He allowed them to survive, often through gifts of food, while observing their weakness. The infamous starving time of the winter of 1609 to 1610 stripped Jamestown to its core. Supplies ran out, and hostile relations with the Powhatan meant they could not venture out for food. Settlers resorted to eating horses, dogs, cats, and finally, grisly acts of cannibalism were recorded. Of the 500 colonists living in Jamestown that fall, barely 60 survived. When a relief fleet arrived in the spring, the survivors were already aboard ships, abandoning the derelict fort, only to be turned back by the arrival of a new governor, Lord Delaware, and fresh supplies. The colony was saved not by gold, but by John Rolfe and the cultivation of a marketable commodity, tobacco. Rolfe successfully crossbred native tobacco strains with sweeter varieties from the West Indies, creating a product highly desirable in the European market. Tobacco farming was immensely profitable, but it was also land-intensive and required massive labor. This need for labor would irrevocably shape the trajectory of Virginia. It fueled the demand for indentured servants from England, and critically led to the introduction of African chattel slavery in 1619, setting a malignant precedent for the entire American South. Faith, fever, and the Compact, Plymouth. 1620, 1,000 miles to the north, a different group, driven by faith rather than finance, was preparing their own desperate gamble. These were the Pilgrims, a small group of religious separatists who believed the Church of England was beyond reform. Seeking to worship God according to their own conscience, they had first fled to Leiden, Holland, but fearing the loss of their English identity and the lure of Dutch license for their children, they sought a new, purer home. Financed by English merchants, the Pilgrims and a larger contingent of strangers, non-separatist immigrants seeking economic opportunity, sailed aboard the Mayflower. Blown far off course, they sighted land not in Virginia, but near Cape Cod in modern-day Massachusetts. Recognizing they were outside the legal jurisdiction of their Virginia Company patent, and facing imminent discord between the saints and the strangers, the leaders drafted and signed the Mayflower Compact on November 11, 1620. This document, a brief but profound statement, established a self-governing political body based on the principle of collective majority rule, a vital early step towards American democracy. Landing at the site of the abandoned Wampanoag village of Patuxet, the Pilgrims faced their own starving time. The winter of 1620 to 1621 was merciless. Exposed to cold and malnutrition, over half the original 102 passengers died. They buried their dead in unmarked graves, fearful that the local Native Americans might observe their diminished numbers. Their survival was miraculous and entirely dependent on the intervention of two crucial figures, Samoset and Tisquantum, Squanto. Samoset, an Abenaki chief, walked into their settlement in March 1621 and greeted them in broken English, learned from earlier fishermen and traders. He introduced them to Squanto, a Pawtuxet man whose life story embodied the chaos of early contact. He taught them how to plant native corn, maize, using fish fertilizer, how to tap maple trees, and where to fish and hunt. He also helped negotiate a critical peace treaty with Massasoit, the paramount chief of the local Wampanoag Confederation. While the Pilgrims established a communal religious society, Virginia became a rapidly expanding capitalist enterprise built on the back of land and labor. The tobacco boom required a fundamental restructuring of the colony. The headright system, established in 1618, proved instrumental in driving mass migration. The company offered 50 acres of land to any settler who paid their own or another as passage to Virginia. This system encouraged wealthy planters to import large numbers of laborers, giving them ownership of both the laborer's journey and the land grant associated with their importation. This system solidified indentured servitude as the primary source of labor in the Chesapeake colonies for most of the 17th century. A poor European could sell 4 to 7 years of their labor to a planter in exchange for the cost of passage. Upon completion of their service, they were often promised freedom dues, which might include tools, a few barrels of corn, and sometimes a small plot of land. While brutal, this system offered a desperate chance at a new life and upward mobility unavailable in class-rigid England. However, the economic model had a dark underside. In August 1619, a Dutch privateer carrying 20 to 30 enslaved Africans captured from a Spanish ship arrived at Point Comfort, Virginia. The Africans were sold to local officials. Though the distinction between an indentured servant and an enslaved person was initially fluid and complex in the law, by the 1660s, a series of legislative acts in Virginia codified racial chattel slavery. The lifelong enslavement of Africans and their descendants, based solely on race, provided the permanent, controllable labor force that the volatile, short-term nature of indentured servitude could not guarantee, ensuring the immense profitability of the tobacco empire. Virginia was sprawling and individualistic, focused on the expansion of private plantations and the accumulation of wealth. Its governance, exemplified by the House of Burgesses, the first elected legislative body in America, was designed to serve the interests of the wealthy landowners. It was a hierarchical, slave-owning aristocracy in the making. Plymouth, and soon the much larger Massachusetts Bay Colony, was communal and spiritually focused. Land was distributed through the town structure, promoting compact settlements centered around the meeting house, church. Their goal was to create a city upon a hill, a model of Christian piety and perfect governance that would inspire the world. The cost of expansion. Both colonies, despite their different motivations, shared one critical feature, an insatiable appetite for land. As their populations stabilized and grew, the need for new fields and space for expanding families or tobacco crops brought them into inevitable, violent conflict with their Native American neighbors. In Virginia, the relationship with the Powhatan Confederacy, strained by the relentless expansion of tobacco fields onto native hunting and planting grounds, snapped. The 1622 uprising, led by Powhatan's successor, Opechancanough, saw a coordinated surprise attack that killed nearly a third of the English population. The English responded with genocidal fury, launching a sustained campaign that devastated the Confederacy. This war justified the English view of the Native Americans as irreconcilable enemies and provided a pretext for seizing vast tracts of land, dissolving any pretense of peaceful coexistence. In New England, the initial treaty held, but as the larger Puritan influx established the Massachusetts Bay Colony 1630 and pushed into Connecticut and Rhode Island, conflicts emerged. The Pequot War of 1637, a vicious retaliatory campaign over land and control of the fur trade, culminated in the horrific massacre at Mystic Fort, where hundreds of Pequot men, women, and children were burned alive by combined English and Allied native forces. By the mid-17th century, the permanent footholds were secured. They had survived their own incompetence, the brutality of the environment, and the determined resistance of the indigenous peoples. But the survival came at an immense cost: the introduction of slavery, the violent displacement of Native Americans, and the establishment of two fundamentally divergent regional identities, the hierarchical, cash crop South and the communal, religiously driven North. These seeds, sown in desperation and watered by blood and tobacco, marked the true, irreversible beginning of the American experience. Would you like me to move on to the third section, which focuses on the rise of the plantation economy?